All right, thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to Spangler Environmental's webinar on the upcoming revisions to the ASTM Phase I Environmental Site Assessment Standard. We're really happy that you're here today. There's going to be a lot of information that's covered, so we hope that you'll enjoy this next 30 minutes or so. My name is Jim Spangler, and I'm the president of Spangler Environmental. I'm very pleased to have joining me today the Risk Management Services Group here at Spangler Environmental. This group is a fantastic group of individuals who have a ton of experience doing phase ones and other types of due diligence projects having to do with land transactions. And I'm just really proud to have them on the line and with us all today. Again, before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions, go ahead and post those down at the bottom of the screen. You will see a Q&A prompt if you move your mouse. Go ahead and hit that and type in your question at any time. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation, and we'll make every effort to get through all of them as we can. So our team of professionals, it's a crack team. They've got here at Spangler Environmental, collectively, the company has well over a century of experience dealing with land transactions and environmental issues. And this group here is just a fantastic group that has had experiences from raw land transactions all the way up through developed property transactions and everything in between. So they've seen just about everything there is to see out there. And that experience has really been beneficial for our clients. Today, we're going to be discussing a very critical element in the transaction process, and that's the risk and liability limiting task of doing a phase one environmental site assessment. I'm very happy to introduce Cal Reeder, who is the director of our Risk Management Services Group. Cal is going to get us started, and so without further ado, let me go ahead and turn the mic over to Cal. Cal, go right ahead.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well. I'm happy to inform you that Friday is coming. So never fear, it will be here before you know it. ESA, as you know, stands for Environmental Site Assessment. Why do you perform a Phase I ESA? The short answer is liability protection, to identify your risk for commercial or industrial property transactions. As a purchaser, it's to ensure that you are protected under the innocent purchaser designation within the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or also known as CERCLA. So that's a little bit of alphabet soup for you. CERCLA has a criteria or a designation, a process, if you will, called all appropriate inquiry. And what that ultimately does is for a potential purchaser or user of this report, it affords you the ability to not be considered the responsible party or potentially liable for any cleanup that may be required for in connection with contamination found on the subject property. So in 1993, ASTM, the American Society for Testing and Materials, developed a standard for environmental site assessments called E1527 and published what is considered today as the industry standard for initial phase of environmental due diligence. This standard has been revised over the years. As early as 1994, they revised it. But most recently, the most recent revision is 2013, which is what we're dealing with today. That standard is set to expire on December 31st of this year. So as you may know, one of the primary conclusions of a Phase I ESA is whether or not you have what is called a recognized environmental condition, or a REC, or an REC. Marianne Grubbs, who you'll meet here in a minute, is going to discuss with you the different types of RECs or RECs and ways to characterize the potential impacts or documented impacts to the subject property. So in today's discussion, it's about the upcoming proposed revisions to the ASTM standard and how these changes may affect you. As Jim mentioned, we absolutely have a crack team. So I am pleased to be joined by Corey McManus, our senior scientist, who's going to explain the changes to the ASTM standard as it relates to historical research and review. David Vail, project environmental scientist here, is going to talk to you about these revisions and how they will impact the site reconnaissance portion of the environmental site assessment. Lastly, and certainly not least, Marianne Grubbs, environmental scientist here at Spangler Environmental, is going to discuss the clarifications of the definition of recognized environmental conditions, RECs, as well as other terms such as HRECs, HRECs, which are historic recognized environmental conditions, and CRECs, which are controlled recognized environmental conditions. In addition, one of the clarifications she will touch on is the overall shelf life of a Phase I ESA. So as you're sitting here right now, you're probably asking yourself two questions. First one's probably, Cal, are you ever going to stop talking? The answer to that is yes. But before I do, let's mention that second question that I know is out there. Will your costs increase as it pertains to Phase I environmental site assessments? Absolutely. If your consultant isn't already incorporating these changes into their processes, it will increase your costs. The good news is Spangler Environmental already includes these changes in our process. So the standard really isn't, the standard is actually catching up to the way Spangler Environmental already goes about Phase I environmental site assessments. So to start you off in the discussion with these revisions, I'm going to hand it over to Corey McManus, Senior Environmental Scientist. Corey?
Thank you, Cal, and thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. When doing a Phase I ESA, it's important to start at the beginning. We do this by looking at historical documents. The big four historical documents available to us are Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, USGS topographic maps, aerial photography, and historic phone directories. Revisions to the standard are going to require the environmental professional to address each of these four, and whether they were reasonably ascertainable or why not. We must address in our final reports whether the documents were reviewed and why they don't contribute to our conclusions in the report. So the first of these four are Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. Between the mid-1800s and the mid-1900s, these maps were utilized in the insurance underwriting process, with the last Sanborn map being produced in 1977. The availability of Sanborn maps depends on the site setting, with much more coverage in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. Historical Sanborns provide information regarding flammable chemical storage, industrial, manufacturing, or commercial uses, and even other things like building construction details. The next of our big four are historic topographic maps. The USGS was founded in the late 1800s with systematic mapping of the United States mandated by Congress shortly thereafter. Some of the major accomplishments of the USGS include mapping of the Grand Canyon in 1923, and they were able to obtain full coverage of the US by 1991. The information we gather from historic topographic maps allows us to build a timeline of site development history and an understanding of the site's physical and environmental setting, obviously topography, but also hydrology and potential contaminant migration pathways. Number 3 on the list is aerial photography. What you're looking at here is the earliest surviving aerial photograph that we know of, taken from Boston in 1860. Aerial photography's first widespread use was for military recon in World War I. And long before the recent advent of drone marketing videos and LiDAR mapping, ingenuitive businessmen and photographers were cavalier in their creative use of the combined technologies. The USDA has been involved in aerial mapping, otherwise known as photogrammetry, over the past 100 years. Information we gather from historic aerial photography allows us to further build a timeline of site development history, as well as things like georeference locations of former structures or land use areas. And number 4 on the list is historic city directories. Phone directories help the environmental professional to identify potentially impactful tenants, such as commercial or industrial facilities, chemical storage or transfer stations. As you can see here, we got a few gas stations and dry cleaners that we identified in these. And similar to Sanborn maps, city directories are more available in urban areas than rural areas, where phone directories either don't exist or are not easy to find. Now, when doing a site assessment, it's important that we also address what's happening on the adjoining properties to identify petroleum storage or hazardous material use, handling, or any releases which could be impacting the subject property. Changes to the standard will require us to address all adjoining properties and include photo documentation for initial site recon and then any subsequent ESA updates. Very often, a site with no other significant environmental concerns may have significant risks or challenges, a site with no other significant environmental concerns may have RECs associated with neighboring release incidents. Furthermore, contaminant migration pathways may traverse property boundaries, and releases on adjoining properties can create significant environmental risks and challenges to subject property development. Similar to the subject property, adjoining properties are assessed through a review of historical documents, regulatory database listings, and physical observations from the property and publicly accessible roads within a half-mile radius of the subject property. That's it for me. I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Mr. David Bale, to address how the new standard will affect our process for site reconnaissance portion of the Phase I. David.
Thank you, Corey. Hi, everyone. As Corey and Cal have mentioned, my name is David Bale. I'm a project environmental scientist here. I'll touch on a few things in the upcoming changes to the site reconnaissance portion of the new ASTM standard. So 3 questions we'll hit are: where do the items in our site reconnaissance checklist come from? What makes them significant? And will there be any significant changes in the items in the new checklist? So first off, where do these items in our site recon come from? They're built from the current ASTM standard, and in addition, we at Spengler Environmental have recognized some regional items that aren't included in the standard that we've added to help us better serve our clients. The new standard is expected to require that the environmental professional identify if each feature in the checklist is observed on the site, describe it in the report, document it with photos, mark it on a site map, and then make the determination if the feature is an REC or not, as well as specifically stating if there are features that are not observed on the site. And what makes these checklist items significant? The items in the ASTM ESA checklist are items that previous committee members have determined are noteworthy, since they commonly are associated with RECs or de minimis conditions and generally need to be discussed in the report, such as soil staining or unidentified substance containers. And will there be any significant changes to the items in the checklist? There's not expected to be any significant changes to the checklist form. However, there will be more stringent and consistent requirements for photo documentation, a description, items observed and not observed, and where these items are located on the site. It'll need to be marked on a map and included in the appendix of the report. One common item that we see almost on every single site visit and that we do are structures, and we can put those in 3 groups of residential, industrial, commercial, and agricultural. Sometimes you end up with structures that are easy to identify the heat source or odors or any specific features, but sometimes you end up with nothing but a foundation or a pile of ruins, and that can really add a level of complexity for determining any potential features that need to be identified. So here's a typical older residential structure that's currently using a heating oil fired furnace. The property in the past had 2 USTs and one likely coming after the other. And you can see these in the photo on the left. All that's left are all that's visible are the fill ports. The tanks are actually still in the ground. And then they've switched over to this AST on the right. So under the new standard, it'll require various items like these to be documented with photos, discussed in the report. A determination will then have to be made by the environmental professional if they represent an REC or not. And finally, the new standard will require that these items be clearly marked on a site map so their locations are easily reproducible should the site conditions change. Or say a car is parked in the driveway right there and hides the 2 vent pipes. It's something that can then be verified by knowing exactly where an item is located on a site. And the new requirements will lead to more definitive and consistent decision making for site observations and the classification of an REC, as well as more defensibility for the environmental professional on their observations and determinations. Now let's take a look at an example from an industrial site. And these photos, you can see the photo on the left, there's staining from some drum storage, and you can see on the markings on that 55-gallon drum, it was a corrosive substance. In addition, we decided to call this an REC based on the proximity to floor drains in that immediate vicinity. The second image shows a chemical mixing room at an industrial facility, and you can clearly see all sorts of staining on the floor, and you can see the hoses where they wash things away. But what's harder to see is there's 2 floor drains in that room. So everything that's spilled in that room is going down the drains. And that room, there's some other features you can't tell from the photos, or one that I took this picture from the exterior doorway. That was a permanently open doorway with just a chain link fence gate on it. And the smell, another thing you can't see in the picture is the smell, which was so strong and so indicative of just numerous releases, was strong enough that we determined it wasn't safe for entry into this room without proper equipment. So we took our photos from the outside, and here's where everything on inside that industrial facility ends up draining. This is their wastewater settlement basin on the property, where every floor drain, sink, in industrial sink, not their restroom, bathroom sinks, but all their cleaning solvents, all their wastewater winds up here for settling and evaporation. And this settlement basin we actually determined represented several RECs. First, you can see there's the material threat to the property from the cracks in the settlement basin walls. And you can see those cracks haven't been there. They're not new. They've been there for quite some time. They've got vegetation growing out of them. So every bit of fluid that's ending up in this basin is ultimately ending up in the soils below the site. Another thing is the basin was dredged right before we got to the site, and the dredgings were then scattered around the woodline of the property, which let us identify another REC. So under the new standard for these instances, it will be required that there are photos of these observations as well as a discussion in the report of each one, including the strong chemical odor, the locations in which these items were observed, where the dredgings were dumped, and finally, the environmental professional must make the determination if these observations are classified as RECs. And all of these features must then be put on a map and marked so that the user has a better understanding of where these observations were made. And this is actually something that Spengler Environmental has been doing for quite some time. We visited this site and wrote this report in September of 2018. This is the kind of forethought that we've been utilizing, which is going to mean we're only having to make minor adaptations to our report process to meet the new ASTM standard. And ultimately, it means there's not going to be a significant change, if any, to our report costs. Lastly, another common item we see in the Southeast are agricultural structures, in particular in North Carolina, tobacco barns. While they're not big, most are about 20 feet by 20 feet, they can have a pretty big impact on the site. Historically, these barns were wood-fired. Later, they used heating oil or kerosene, and it wasn't until much later that they started using propane. Tobacco barns that use liquid fuels, such as the heating oil or the kerosene, are notorious for having areas of petroleum impacted soils below the barns. Due to the low cost of fuels, when they were operated, leaks rarely got repaired in timely manners, and they were only operated in a portion of the year. So if a leak happened in the off season, a slow leak may go unattended for months on end, which leaves plenty of time to have a big impact on the site. And we at Spengler Environmental have extensive experience identifying the potential issues associated with these structures and facilitating the cleanup of the soils for various clients as a result of these releases. These releases the cleanups from them can range from small few dump truck loads sized excavations to relatively large scale ones. You can actually see a couple photos here where there is a bulldozer that was used inside the excavation. It was so big. That one, I believe we took out over 4,000 tons of petroleum impacted soil below a property. And to put that in perspective, that's the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools side by side. So to bring it all into focus, the new ASTM standard is going to require that every checklist item observed on the site be described in the report, documented with photos, marked on a site map, as well as require the environmental professional to specifically state if the items observed are classified as an REC or not. This, along with other metrics being required as a part of the new ASTM standard, will create more consistency in the classification of various observations. Fortunately, through Spengler Environmental's extensive industry experience over the years and throughout the Southeast, this is already a well-established process for the Spengler Environmental team. And there will really only be minimal revisions to our reporting process to ensure that we're within the new ASTM standard requirements as soon as they're officially released later this year, which again results in us not really being set back. We're ultimately just able to keep consistently delivering a high quality report without having to totally revamp our process and increase our cost. And with that, I'd like to pass things off to my colleague, Marianne, to talk about some of the other items in the new ASTM standard. Marianne?
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne Grubbs, an environmental scientist here at Spengler Environmental. And I want to dive in right into that last step in the Phase I ESA process. So now that we've gone through the standard record review and site reconnaissance portions that Corey and David have described, it's time to draw our conclusions whether any of the scenarios that we've encountered rises to the level of one of the defined terms in the standard. The most notable of which, of course, is the recognized environmental condition, affectionately known as REC or a REC. Now, one of the big revisions under debate with the upcoming revision is how to clarify the definition of REC, specifically focusing on that likely presence or the material threat phrasing that can be a little bit ambiguous. The goal being, of course, to encourage more consistent determinations from environmental professionals across the industry. So what we've heard from members of the task force currently working on the revisions is 2 things. One, the definition itself may change slightly to really incorporate the consideration for professional judgment in addition to the facts and hard evidence gained during the standard record review and site reconnaissance portions. And 2 is to bolster that non-mandatory appendices section of the standard with good examples and a decision flow chart to get everyone on a similar thought process when they're making their determinations. Now, I've included the current version of the definition as listed in the 2013 standard. It's a lot of verbiage, kind of legalese, so I'm not going to read it verbatim for you. But what I'll tell you is that from the environmental professional's perspective, every project is different. There are many situations that are kind of on the fence and really require discussion either among colleagues or maybe even some research before we make our determinations. Let's put this into practice. Let you put on your EP hat for a day. Look at gas stations. These are always a red flag, but just because you have one either on your subject property or adjacent does not automatically mean that you're going to have an issue. It really depends on a lot of different factors. So let's take a look at 2 examples and really highlight the difference. Scenario number 1, this is going to be your friendly neighborhood quick stop. Let's say it's about 100 feet away from your subject property and topographically up gradient. That meaning that surface water and groundwater could potentially carry contamination towards your subject property and cause an issue. Now, this site is listed on your radius map under the state database for commercially regulated underground storage tanks, or USTs. That database itself is going to give you a lot of specific details about your registered tanks, as you can see in the table on your slide. Now, since it's a commercially regulated facility, it's presumably inspected by your state on a regular basis. And during your review of the database listing, available documentation on file with the regulatory agency, and possibly even interviews with an agency official if warranted, you did not uncover any open violations or documented releases. So what's your determination? Now, of course, there's a potential for impact to your subject property if a release were to occur. Since the site is up gradient, like I said earlier, any contamination could migrate towards your site, but there are no documented releases that you're aware of, and there are multiple protections in place. The features of the tanks themselves described in the tables, and then with regular monitoring by the gas station personnel, and then inspections by your regulatory agency, any releases should be detected fairly quickly and either cleaned up or contained as close to that gas station facility as possible. So with these conditions in mind, that gas station would not represent the likely presence or material threat of petroleum products on your subject property, and therefore it would not qualify as an REC. Now, scenario number 2. You're doing your historical research on a new subject property to prepare for the site reconnaissance portion, and you find some questionable things on your historical documents, such as a filling station on an old sandboard map and a mobile station or shell station listed on city directories as early as 1954. Now, this site is not going to be identified on the radius map for state or federal databases. And of course, an interview with the current property owner doesn't provide any additional relevant information. Now, once you go to the site, you observe a dispenser island with fill ports and product lines in place, and what appears to be a second dispenser island that has been removed. And going through that site reconnaissance checklist that David was going through earlier, you don't see any staining, distressed vegetation, smell any petroleum odors, or any other indication of a release while you're on site. So what's the determination for this gas station? Now, gathering all of our data from the phase 1 process together so far, we know that there were USTs on site at one time, but of course we can't confirm how many were there, the status of the tanks, or any other specific information. Based on historical documents, we can estimate that the tanks were installed as early as the 1950s, and with observations of the dispenser island still in place at the site, it would suggest that the USTs are still in the ground, but of course we can't confirm that through observations on the surface during a phase 1. So no documented releases and no observations suggesting the release, but here's what the task force is trying to incorporate into the revision with regards to the professional judgment piece. Industry knowledge can give us a lot of good information, especially about facilities like historical gas stations. They're widespread, they've been around for a really long time, and of course they're fairly well studied. So to give you a little bit of background, prior to the mid to late 1980s, underground storage tanks were not regulated by any state or federal agency. They were typically constructed of bare steel with few or no safeguards in place, nor were there any regulations that enforced proper closure or removal procedures. So what does that result in? It's not uncommon to find abandoned or undocumented underground storage tanks being left in the ground, and oftentimes with substances still in them. And it's also commonly found that over time, the tank and the piping material can deteriorate and allow the contents to release into the soil and groundwater around your tanks. So applying this industry knowledge back to the historical gas station on our subject property, we again say that no documented releases and no observations were found that indicated a release. But based on the available information with the estimated installation back to the early 1950s, that date and the industry knowledge makes it safe to assume that the USTs were constructed of bare steel. There were few or no protections in place. And with the tanks having been in the ground for 70 years, it's likely that either the tank or the associated piping have released. And that, in that case, this gas station would qualify as an REC. Now let's take a look at two of the other defined terms that are up for revision. Both the controlled and the historical RECs are byproducts or essentially RECs from past releases that have been addressed to the satisfaction of the applicable regulatory authority in one of two ways. Now, if it meets the unrestricted use criteria, it's an HREC or historical recognized environmental condition. If it meets the risk-based criteria and they allow contamination to remain in place at the site with institutional engineering controls, such as a deed restriction or some sort of permanent remediation system in place at the site, that would qualify as a controlled REC. In both cases, a notice of no further action or the equivalent would be issued by the regulatory authority and that incident would close out. Now, the issue under consideration is that regulations change over time as we gain more knowledge about the substances, how they interact with the environment and what threats they pose for human health. These regulations are going to differ, of course, depending on the type of incident, the governing body from state to state or even state to federal. And to compensate for that, the task force currently revising the standard is wanting to expand that phrasing that I've highlighted for you on the slide that addressed to the satisfaction of the applicable regulatory authority to really specify that your incident must meet the current regulatory requirements. So from the environmental professional's perspective, this will require a little extra effort to review the most recent analytical data on file for an incident and compare it to the current regulatory requirements before we can qualify it as an HREC or a CREC. So now that our conclusions are drawn and we've qualified all of our findings appropriately as an REC or other designations, Cal will send you a draft of the report and discuss next steps with you. One of the last revisions being considered for the new version of the standard is to clarify the language of the lifespan of the report. So the current standard establishes that 180-day shelf life, but it doesn't really specify when that clock starts. You might be in the same boat with us, but a lot of environmental professionals and users are currently interpreting that to mean the date of the report, which is at the end, of course, of your 2 to 3 week phase 1 process. However, the proposed revision is to say that all components of your phase 1 process must be completed within that 180 days. Now that includes, of course, a standard record review, site reconnaissance, interviews, and etc. So that essentially means that you're losing 2 to 3 weeks off the lifespan of your report, since a lot of those components start very early in the process. These dates, of course, are going to be documented in the report, and Spangler Environmental will keep track of that 180-day window for all projects in case you have any questions. As the your goal as the user is to go ahead and engage Spangler Environmental as early as possible in your due diligence period to get an understanding of any possible risks you may be facing and what the options are to deal with them before you close. Now, if that 180-day window poses an issue, there are options to consider. I'm going to pass the virtual mic back to Cal so he can discuss these options with us and wrap us up. Cal?
Thank you so much, Marianne. Great stuff. So hopefully you're coming away with about 3 takeaways, maybe more, but at least 3. One of which is these revisions hopefully will create a standard to match the good commercial and customary practices of today. As we've touched on, Spangler Environmental already incorporates these changes in our processes. So current clients will see very minor changes, if any, to the overall Spangler Environmental report template. The other thing that I wanted to make sure you guys took away from this was the timeline. So as we mentioned, the timeline for these new ASTM publications is expected before the end of the year, but we anticipate it to be in the fall of this year. The other thing I was hoping that you guys would take away would be, as the user, you have options. As Marianne mentioned, each site is different, but also each user and potential purchaser is different, and you each have different risk tolerances. So depending on your risk tolerances and the timing of your transaction to take ownership of the property, you have a couple of different opportunities or approaches to ultimately keep the deal moving forward and flush out what your liability and risks are. One of which is you always have the opportunity to do a new phase one if you're running up on or running past that 180-day time frame. If you're within that 180 days, you can also do what's called a phase one update. The other thing that you have afforded to you is what is called a transaction screen. The ASTM has a standardized process. It's called 1528-14. It's a lower cost. It's a much more streamlined process. But what it does not do, it does not satisfy all appropriate inquiry. So it's not a catch-all. It could be useful if you have, say, a finished lot deal or phase takedowns of a overall parent property once you have already conducted that initial phase one. So you do have options, and we're absolutely here to help. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either myself or anybody else that you have heard from today.
Fantastic, team. That was great. Really appreciate the effort that has gone into the presentation, and I know that our audience has as well. We've had some questions come in. One of them came in to me by text, and a couple others have come in the Q&A, and those we'll try to get through first. So, Cal, one of the things that has been asked is a phase one required when purchasing a single family residence? And I think that's a cost related issue. Obviously, the transaction sizes may be different than a larger land deal. As well, there's a kind of a second question there about whether a person could just do their own phase one. Would that be sufficient? Do they need to come to a company like ours? So why don't you take a stab at that two-part question, if you would, please?
I will stab away. So that first part, is a phase one required when purchasing a new single family residence? The simple answer is no. In general, no. Where it may be required, obviously it depends on your risk tolerance. You may want that comfort in knowing there are no documented impacts to the environment of your subject property, or there aren't any risks for you in purchasing that property. The other possibility where it may be required is if it's required by your lender. Each lender, just like you, the user or a purchaser, have your own risk tolerances, so do lenders, as you might imagine. And so they may require it as a part of satisfying the due diligence for obtaining a loan. But in general, just for a single family residence, it is not required. Could you do it? a little bit of a loaded question, but yes, you could. The caveat is this: you would need to satisfy the criteria within the ASTM as being an environmental professional. So if you meet that criteria, you could. I would not recommend it. I would encourage anybody to have somebody who is experienced in phase one environmental site assessments, but certainly at a minimum satisfies the criteria of a environmental professional as defined with the ASTM standard. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Cal. That was great. Another question that's come in has to do with the physical site assessment process, I believe. And David, you're probably the best one to answer this question. The question is, what happens when the site next door is contaminated? And I think the person asking the question is probably focused on not just the physical observations, but then how does that parlay itself into the report process?
Thanks, Jim. So when the site next door is contaminated, it doesn't need to be a deal breaker. It doesn't need to stop things from moving forward. But when we come across a neighboring property that does have either a mapped incident or we observe a release on site on that neighboring site, we will evaluate it to understand that is there any possible impact to the subject property from that adjoining site. It may be that we're up gradient and there's a stream running from our site down across that neighboring contaminated site that would be carrying most contaminants away from the subject property, in which case that wouldn't constitute an REC for the report. So if the scenario is reversed and the contaminated site is up gradient from the subject property, we'd still evaluate and see, does it look like there's any way that that contamination is making it towards our property, and is there that likely risk of our site being impacted? And that can end up launching into a whole nother discussion of sampling and looking into, is there a physical impact to the site? But just because there's contamination on a neighboring site doesn't really need to make you shy away from continuing to explore the options with, does it actually impact it? Does it impact your property? Or is it more of just an eyesore on a neighboring property?
Great, thanks, David. Appreciate that. I've gotten a couple of them by text. One of these, I think, Corey, you're probably the best one to answer this. Has to do with your reference to the Big Four historical data sources. And the question is two parts. The first is, do you have to use all four? And is there something else that you could use? So I think the question is that mandatory that you use all four? And if you don't have all four, can you use something else? And how do you deal with that?
That's a great question, and thank you, Jim. You do have to address the availability of all four, whether you end up using them or not. You do have to address their availability and your attempt to acquire that information. Now, if they're not available and you can't use them, you will have to state that much at least. There are other additional historical resources available to us. Oftentimes the Big Four will, either one or a combination of those, will point us to an issue that we want to get additional clarification on, or a couple of my favorite additional historical resources are local firemen, local police officers. You can call into the local fire department, the local police department, ask to speak to the guy who's been there the longest, and they can give you, they'll have knowledge of the area and of potential issues that may have happened. Like, let's say a tanker got knocked over and they got called out to that incident. Police stations and fire stations also keep records by address of calls they've made. And so that and other like historical maps, street maps, can kind of allow us to build a better idea of the history of a site. But those Big Four are called the Big Four for a reason. They give us a lot of information, and reviewing those will often find any issues that you may be looking for this historical document. So hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please feel free to call me or email me anytime. I'd like to talk with it more about anybody who's interested. So thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, that's also something that will pop up in your report when there's a missing piece of data. You'll see references to a data gap or a data failure. Those are defined terms in the ASTM standard. Those are not things that necessarily make your Phase I ESA invalid, but they are things that have to be documented now explicitly. So keep your eyes open for missing pieces of data in your Phase Is and make sure that they're covered in the data failure or data gap sections so that you do comply with the all appropriate inquiry criteria for CERCLA liability protections. Marianne, another question came in that I think is just a kind of a review question, and that is if you could just briefly explain the differences between a REC, an HREC, and a CREC. Those are acronyms that you referenced in, I think, just one more time, somebody wants to hear them again. Can you elaborate a little bit, please?
Sure. That is the very basis of the whole Phase I process. So you're trying to identify whether or not you have the presence of a recognized environmental condition or the REC on your property. That is that is conditions that show either a historical release, a current release, or the material threat of a future release of either petroleum products or hazardous substances into the soil, groundwater, or structures at your subject property. Now that is a recognized environmental condition. If we look at RECs that have been satisfied to the regulatory authority, they've been either cleaned up where you don't have any further restrictions in place, that would be a historical. So you have a past release, got cleaned up, and the regulatory agency says you're good to go, no further issue, that's a historical REC. So it's still important to note, but not many concerns with that. Now with the controlled REC, it's a past release that the regulatory agency has addressed, but you have contamination remaining at the site. So they are aware of it, and they've either put a deed restriction, restricting access to either soil or groundwater at the site, restricting the use of the property, residential versus commercial and industrial uses, or you can have an engineering control such as some sort of permanent remediation system in place to actively work on that contamination. In either of those cases, that would be a controlled REC. So still important to know, and that might mean something very different for your intended development uses. So hopefully that clears that up, and we're every situation's different, takes some interpretation, but we're happy to help clarify any of those questions for you.
Thanks, Marianne. Good stuff. The last question that'll take us out is a general question, and it's absolutely the kind of the crux of the matter, and that is, the question is, if your site has contamination, can you or should you still buy it? Sure, you can buy a site that has contamination. There's absolutely no prohibition on that. The real question is, what is your risk tolerance? And that is the whole reason that we go through the Phase I environmental site assessment process, to put bounds on your risk tolerance and allow you to make a good business decision, allow you to change the decision process from being a nebulous and subjective process, an environmental subjective process, to an objective fact-based business decision that you can make with confidence. So certainly you can buy a contaminated property, but hopefully if you do, you will buy that property with the knowledge, the full knowledge of the extent of that risk, and be able to come to terms with it in a way that still makes your deal viable. Ultimately, we're here to help you keep your deals going. Our team here in the risk management services group is a crack team that is tackling these issues daily for banks and attorneys and land developers and builders across the entire Southeast. Our projects right now in this area are ranging from Virginia down into Florida. And so we're on the ground in all those places every day of the week. If you also have due diligence needs in the land or water resources sector, you can certainly reach out to us for those things as well. Let me mention that this presentation is going to be saved on our website. If you need to go back and look at it again, please feel free to do so. You'll be able to see that here very soon on the website and refresh your memory on all the things that our team has relayed to you today. It's a special day today. It's April 22nd, 2021, and it's Earth Day. So this is a great subject to discuss on Earth Day. And I hope that each and every one of you have an opportunity to get outside and enjoy what God has given to us all. And I thank you very much for attending. If you have any questions about any environmental issue, please reach out to us at the number on your screen or at the email addresses that you see as well. We're here to help you succeed. Thank you so much for joining us.